2,800 years ago, a blind poet known as Homer would produce two epic works. The Iliad would tell the tale of the Trojan War, where a great city was conquered by one of the most devious plans in history. But with the Trojans having been defeated, the blind poet would now turn his attention to Odysseus, with his second epic, the Odyssey, documenting his journey home. Having constructed the Trojan horse, Odysseus had ensured victory against all odds and proved his reputation as the most cunning of the Greeks. But throughout it all, Odysseus only longed for one thing: to finally return to his homeland of Ithaca, where he could be reunited with his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. But while his family awaited his return, Odysseus's journey home would take 10 long years, during which he and his crew would have to face the most terrifying creatures known to man. A journey so epic, its tale would be told for thousands of years. This is his story. Odysseus ruled over the Greek island of Ithaca, but had spent 10 long years fighting in Troy to retrieve the Spartan queen Helen. But with his mission now complete, Odysseus looked to travel back to his homeland, where his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus awaited. Gathering his fleet of ships on the Trojan shores, Odysseus would set sail, relieved to be finally returning home. With Troy in ruins, they would first head north to look for supplies, landing on the shores of Ismara, home to the Ciconians, a Thracian tribe who had fought on the side of the Trojans. Gathering the supplies they needed, Odysseus and his men would find themselves under attack from the Ciconians. But overwhelmed by such a large tribe, they were forced to retreat back to their ships, with their journey soon resuming. Heading south, they would sail round the shores of Greece, before heading north towards Ithaca. But as they neared home, a great storm erupted, blowing them off course and towards the island of the Lotus Eaters. Lost and confused, Odysseus and his crew would leave their ships, soon asking the island's inhabitants for help and directions. But rather than give them directions, they would offer something instead: the fruit of the island's many lotus trees. Unknown to Odysseus, the lotus fruit contained a powerful drug that made those who consumed it fall asleep, forgetting their past and wanting to stay on the island forever. As several of his crew began to fall down around him, Odysseus would realize the sinister nature of the fruit, quickly forbidding its consumption. Rescuing his sleeping companions, he would carry them to their ships, making a quick escape and heading out to sea. But having been blown off course, Odysseus and his fleet had been at sea for longer than expected, with them now running low on supplies. Stopping at the first island they came across, they would soon spot a shepherd's camp in the distance, with Odysseus hand-picking a small group of warriors to accompany him. Taking several cases of wine to trade, the hungry crew were overjoyed when they saw large supplies of cheese and meat within a cave next to the shepherd's flock. The warriors would help themselves to the supplies, but soon the cave's owner would return, the giant Cyclops Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon, who sealed the entrance with a giant boulder. Ignoring Odysseus's cries that he was there to trade, Polyphemus would grab 2 of the warriors, crushing them each in his fists before eating their remains. He would then leave the cave, returning each morning and evening to feast on what remained of the terrified crew. Knowing the odds were stacked against him yet again, Odysseus would devise a cunning plan to escape. Realizing he couldn't overpower Polyphemus, he would offer the Cyclops the wine he had brought with him, to help wash down the taste of his friends. With the Cyclops soon falling down drunk, he would ask for Odysseus's name in order to thank him for the gift. But instead of giving his true name, Odysseus would insist that he was called Nobody. Thanking Nobody, Polyphemus would soon fall asleep, where Odysseus would begin to sharpen a wooden stake he had found in the cave. Approaching the sleeping giant, he would plunge the stake deep into his eye, blinding the Cyclops, but making sure not to kill him, as the boulder blocking the cave's entrance would still have to be moved. Polyphemus would scream out in agony, a scream so loud that Cyclopses from across the island would rush to the cave. Calling out to Polyphemus, they would ask, "What's wrong? Who's kidding you?" But Polyphemus would shout back, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody." It was just as Odysseus had planned, with the Cyclopses soon leaving in confusion. But while Polyphemus was now blind, there was no way for the men to move the giant boulder blocking the entrance, with Odysseus coming up with yet another plan. When Polyphemus went to move the boulder the next morning to let his sheep out to graze, he would feel each of the animals as they passed to check it wasn't one of the humans. But Odysseus and his men would each tie themselves to the bottom of the sheep, allowing them to pass by undetected. Reaching their ships, they would manage to escape the island, with Polyphemus hurling boulders in their direction as they sailed away. But Odysseus would make a costly mistake. Overcome by his achievement, he would reveal to the Cyclops that his name was not Nobody, but instead Odysseus, the famous hero of the Trojan War. Unknown to Odysseus, this would allow Polyphemus to give the name of his attacker to his father Poseidon, the god of the sea, who in revenge for his son's blinding would curse Odysseus to lose all his crew in his coming travels, and wander the seas for 10 long years before he could set foot on his homeland. Unaware of the curse Poseidon had placed upon him, Odysseus and his crew would land on the floating island of Aeolia. After dining with his guests, King Aeolus, who ruled the island, would offer Odysseus a parting gift, a leather bag containing the power of the winds, which, if used with great precision, could speed his journey home. Setting sail once more, Odysseus would make use of the winds, with his homeland of Ithaca soon in sight. But as he neared the island's shores, his crew, believing the bag Aeolus had given him contained large sums of gold and silver, decided to take some for themselves. Opening the bag while Odysseus's back was turned, all the winds rushed out at once, blowing their ships back into the ocean, with all aboard holding on for their lives. They would arrive at the island of Aeola once again, but this time their arrival would not be met with the same generosity they had received before. For King Aeolus, knowing that only a curse from the gods could have brought Odysseus back to his island, would refuse to aid him any further, expelling him from the palace to avoid the wrath of the gods. Still unaware of Poseidon's curse, Odysseus would set sail once more, but just like his previous attempts to reach his homeland, this time would also hold misfortune. Arriving at the harbor of Laestrygonia, Odysseus would send out 3 scouts to find food and the people of the town. But the scouts would soon realize they were not in a place of people at all, being chased by giants back to their ships. Bloodthirsty cannibals, the giant Laestrygonians would begin to devour the scouts, with them soon turning their attention to Odysseus's ships in the harbor. Pelting them with boulders, the Laestrygonians would destroy every ship bar one, with Odysseus barely making it out alive. Tired and depleted, Odysseus's only remaining ship would soon arrive at the island of Aeaea, which was home to the beautiful witch Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios. Splitting his men into two groups, Odysseus would stay by his ship and set up camp, while the others searched the island for food. They would soon arrive at the house of Circe, where docile wolves and lions quivered at her feet. Inviting the men to dine with her, she would serve them a large cup of barley, cheese, and wine. But unknown to the men, there was one secret ingredient placed within. Having eaten the meal, the men would begin to fall asleep. But when they awoke, they were no longer in human form. Instead, they took the body of pigs. But one man, not having an appetite for food, had seen the events unfold, quickly running to Odysseus to tell him of the fate of his crew. Hearing the news, Odysseus immediately set off to rescue his men, but along the way, he was stopped by the messenger god Hermes, who had come to aid him. Giving Odysseus moly, a magic herb, Hermes would tell him to place it in Circe's potions, so as not to feel the effect of her enchantments. Taking the moly, Odysseus would approach Circe and begin to dine with her, surprising the witch when he remained in human form. Drawing his sword, he stood up and threatened to kill Circe unless she transformed his crew back into humans. With the sword at her throat, Circe would quickly agree, with the pigs at her feet transforming back into men. So impressed by Odysseus's heroics, Circe would invite him to her bedchamber, with the two having a son together named Telegonus. Remaining on the island for a whole year, Odysseus decided it was time to leave, but as he began to set sail, Circe would advise him to visit the underworld, where the prophet Tiresias could advise him on how to survive the many trials that awaited him at sea. Following Circe's advice, Odysseus would travel west to the edge of the world, where an entrance to the underworld was located. Completing a ritual sacrifice at the entrance, Odysseus would summon the spirits of the dead, where the blind prophet Tiresias would appear. He warned that Odysseus and his men would soon find themselves on the island of the sun god Helios, and that they should refrain from eating his cattle if they wanted to make it home alive. If, however, they harmed the cattle in any way, then death would follow. Thanking the prophet, Odysseus would leave in his ship, determined that when the time came, no man would touch the sun god's cattle. But soon after setting sail, Odysseus and his men would begin to hear a beautiful melody, for his ship was passing the home of the sirens, irresistible creatures that enticed sailors to their death with their bewitching songs. However, this time Odysseus had come prepared. Remembering the advice that Circe had given him, he would instruct his crew to plug their ears with beeswax, so they could not be seduced by the siren's call. But Odysseus, wanting to be the first man to hear the song and survive, would not plug his ears with wax, instead asking his crew to bind him to the ship's mast. And so, as the ship passed the sirens' home, and their songs grew louder and louder, Odysseus would begin to struggle. Drawn to the sound with every fiber of his being, he would plead with his men to let him go. But no one would answer his call, as the wax continued to block their ears. Eventually making it through safely, Odysseus would be set free, having been the first man to survive the siren's call. But unknown to him, the sirens were fated to die if a mortal ever resisted their enchanting song, with each of them taking their own life as his ship sailed into the horizon. If you love art as much as us and are captivated by the beauty of some of the pieces you have already seen in this video, then you are going to love today's sponsor. With over 400,000 users, Masterworks.io is a platform dedicated to securitizing blue-chip artwork for both retail and accredited investors. In the past, only billionaires and the super-rich were able to invest in art, and that's what's amazing about Masterworks.io. They are now making investing in art accessible to all. With over 75 years of art buying experience, Masterworks.io are one of the largest buyers in the art market today, letting you invest in multi-million-dollar works by artists like Banksy, Andy Warhol, and even Monet. They acquire top works from the best artists, either through public auction or private sale, and then allow members to invest in those individual works. Think of it like buying a slice of pizza, instead of needing to buy the whole pie. In a time of high inflation, it's always been wise to diversify your portfolio. In fact, from 1995 to 2020, contemporary art prices have outperformed the S&P 500 by 164%. Don't want to wait until they find a buyer to see a return? No problem. Masterworks.io also offers a secondary market on their website, where you can sell your shares to another member. What's even better is that Life Guide viewers can gain priority access and skip their long wait list by clicking the link in the description. Click the link in the description and sign up to Masterworks.io today. As the next day dawned, Odysseus had a difficult decision to make. For Circe, using her magic, had warned him of the dangers that lay ahead when he came across a narrow pass. On each side would lay incredible danger, with the right home to Scylla, a giant six-headed sea monster, and the left home to Captorus, a whirlpool that consumed anything that came near. Heeding Circe's advice yet again, Odysseus would head towards Scylla, for while the monster would take 6 of his men, it was a price he was willing to pay, as Captorus would take his entire ship. And so, with a heavy heart, he would direct his men towards the cliff face, where Scylla lay in wait. As the ship passed, 6 heads would swoop down from above, each taking a sailor, who screamed as they were consumed by the beast. But with a great storm on the horizon, they had no time to mourn their companions, with them soon stopping on the island of Thrinacia. Thrinacia was home to the cattle of the sun god Helios, cattle that Odysseus had been warned not to consume by the prophet Tiresias in the underworld. But despite Odysseus instructing his men not to touch the cattle, it would not be easy for them to follow his orders, as the storm had kept them stranded on the island for nearly a month. With their food supplies all but gone, the crew, on the brink of starvation, would wait for Odysseus to fall asleep, killing all the cattle and roasting the meat to enjoy amongst themselves. When Odysseus awoke the next morning, he would fall to his knees in despair, shaking his head in disbelief at the foolishness of his crew. However, although the crew had ignored his orders, the storm had now calmed, with them setting off to sea once again. But their crime had not gone unnoticed, with the sun god Helios complaining to Zeus, the king of the gods, about the slaughter of his cattle. Furious, Zeus would strike Odysseus's ship with a great thunderbolt, tearing it in half, with all the crew drowning bar one. For as fate predicted, Poseidon's curse had come to pass, with only Odysseus having survived the carnage, with him clinging to the broken remains of his ship. For 9 days and nights he would drift across the vast ocean, but on the 10th day he would wash up on the island of the goddess Calypso. Upon rescuing Odysseus from the shore, Calypso, the daughter of the Titan Atlas, would fall in love with him, asking if he'd stay on the island with her forever, even offering to make him immortal. But Odysseus, longing to see his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, would reject her advances, insisting that he wanted to leave. However, Calypso, insulted by his rejection, would keep Odysseus captive on the island for the next 7 years. Being forced to lie with the goddess, Odysseus would spend every night crying on the shore, wishing to see his wife and son once again. But high on Mount Olympus, the goddess Athena, having supported Odysseus since the Trojan War, would look down upon him with sadness in her heart, until one day she could not stand by any longer. Begging Zeus to finally allow Odysseus to return home, Athena would make her case, with Zeus ordering Calypso to set him free. Reluctantly, Calypso would agree, helping Odysseus to build a raft to sail home. But as he was nearing his homeland, Poseidon would hear of Odysseus's escape, conjuring a storm to destroy his raft. Barely surviving, Odysseus would manage to swim to the island of Syria, where he would stumble onto the shore completely naked, before falling asleep. The island of Syria was home to the Phaeacians, ruled by King Alcinous and Queen Arete. The day after Odysseus's arrival, their daughter Nausicaa would go down to the sea with her maids to wash their clothes, only to find Odysseus standing naked on the shore. Shocked by the sight of a naked man, her maids would run away, screaming in terror. But Nausicaa, given courage and being prompted by Athena, would stand her ground. Giving Odysseus some clothes, Nausicaa would take him back to her palace, where she would introduce him to her parents. Inviting the stranger inside, the king and queen would ask Odysseus to dine with them before enjoying entertainment provided by Demodocus the poet, who was known for his songs inspired by the gods. As the night unfolded, the king would ask Odysseus to reveal his name and story, but Odysseus, reluctant to give his name after it had led to Poseidon's curse, would try to avoid the question, instead talking of the great sights he had seen on his travels. After a great feast, Demodocus would begin to play his beautiful tunes, singing of the gods of Olympus, but soon the poet's attention would turn to the tale of Troy. He would sing of its many heroes, of Achilles and Agamemnon, and of the famous Odysseus, the maker of the wooden horse and the most cunning of the Greeks. Awed by the tale of the Trojan horse, of how a man so intelligent had managed to outwit the Trojans, the crowd would begin to cheer. But Odysseus, thinking only of the many friends he had lost, would grab his robe and begin to weep, wiping the tears from his eyes. However, the king, hearing Odysseus sobbing, would become suspicious, asking for the man's identity. Overwhelmed that his tale was being told across the land, and mesmerized by the poet's beautiful singing, he would reveal that his name was Odysseus, the famous hero of the Trojan War. But rather than returning home after the conflict, Odysseus would explain that he'd been wandering the ocean for 10 long years, with every attempt to reach his homeland having ended in tragedy. Amazed by the story and honored to have such a great hero in their midst, the king and queen would do everything they could to help him. The next morning, Odysseus would awake to find a ship in the harbor, loaded with gold and silver, and a crew ready to help him return home. Setting sail, Odysseus would thank the king and queen, with his eyes now set firmly upon his homeland. 20 years after leaving home, Odysseus would finally set foot on Ithaca, ready to see his wife and son once again. But Athena, knowing that his homeland was not as he had left it, would warn Odysseus of the dangers that waited in his palace, transforming him into an old beggar. Athena made sure that Odysseus would enter his home in disguise. For his wife Penelope, having been alone for 20 years, was expected to remarry, with suitors from far and wide coming to win her hand. Over 100 of them now infested Odysseus's palace, eating his food and wearing his clothes. Although throughout it all, Penelope had remained faithful, never giving up hope that her husband would return. Devising a cunning plan to avoid marriage, Penelope had stalled her many suitors for years, weaving a burial garment for Odysseus's father, promising that she would choose a new husband when it was finished. But every night, as the garment neared completion, she would secretly undo all her work, with the deception lasting for 3 years before it was uncovered, with her now being forced to choose a suitor. But unknown to Penelope, Odysseus would soon be by her side. Making his way to the palace, he would first stop at the house of his most loyal servant Eumaeus. Happy to see his king once again, Eumaeus would offer Odysseus food and wine, while pledging to help him reclaim his home. It would not be long before another would join them, for Odysseus's son Telemachus had just arrived home from his travels after searching for his father for many months. Making his way up to the palace, Telemachus would see Eumaeus dining with a stranger, and hungry after his long voyage, would ask his friend if he could join for dinner. But Eumaeus, knowing the beggar's true identity, would seek to give the two some time together, leaving to let Penelope know that her son had returned. With Eumaeus now gone, Athena would use her magic to transform the old beggar back into Odysseus in all his glory. Telemachus could not believe his eyes and would begin to weep, having been reunited with his father after all this time. Dropping to his knees, Telemachus would embrace his father with open arms, but their reunion would have to wait, as for now, Odysseus would have to deal with the suitors that infested his home. Disguising himself as a beggar once again, Odysseus would enter the palace, only to discover that Penelope had set up a competition to choose her next husband. She had declared that she would marry the man who could shoot an arrow through a row of 12 axe heads, with every suitor in the land having joined the competition. But there would be one condition, that each suitor must use Odysseus's great bow that had been left behind at the palace. It was another of Penelope's cunning tricks, as one after another, every suitor would take their turn, each unable to even string the bow. After every man had failed, Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar, would ask for an attempt, with the whole palace howling with laughter. But they would soon fall quiet, for Odysseus would string the bow with ease, taking aim and shooting an arrow that sailed through all 12 axes with perfect precision. But having seen the damage done to his home, Odysseus could not forgive the suitors. Turning the bow upon them, Odysseus would begin to fire, striking them down one by one. Panicked, the suitors would go to grab their weapons, but no matter how hard they looked, they could not be found, as Telemachus had hid their weapons while the competition was underway. With Eumaeus then joining Telemachus and Odysseus, they would begin to attack the suitors, not stopping until they had all been killed. With the bodies of the suitors now laying dead at his feet, Odysseus had completed his final task. The only thing left to do was to reunite with his wife, with his undying love for her being the only thing that had fueled his journey home. Recognizing her husband and overwhelmed with emotion, Penelope would embrace Odysseus, a moment she had spent 20 long and faithful years waiting for. Letting out a sigh of relief, Odysseus was finally at peace, but his wife would have one question for him, asking where he'd been after all this time. With a smile on his face and tears in his eyes, he would reply with one simple line, "Where do I begin?"